She was 34 years old, and the laughter followed her all the way from the auction steps to the edge of town. The people who laughed were her own neighbors in the settlement of Briar Hollow, men and women she had fed and doctored and sat with through hard winters. And they laughed because after her husband's debt swallowed the family farm, all she had left in the world was $11 and a stubborn refusal to leave the only home she had ever known. What she did with those $11, standing in the dust while the crowd chuckled behind their hands, was by the collapsed smokehouse at the edge of the old Vance property, a leaning ruin of blackened timber that had not cured a single ham in over a decade and that everyone agreed was fit for nothing but kindling. They laughed harder when she began hauling out the fallen beams herself, and harder still when she climbed into the rafters with a lantern instead of simply burning the whole structure to the ground as any sensible person would have done. What she found wedged among those smoke-blackened rafters would not just silence every last one of those laughing voices, it would uncover debt Briar Hollow itself had been quietly avoiding for 18 years, and it would give her back far more than the farm she had lost. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Rosalind Pruitt. If you have ever been laughed at for holding on to something everyone else had already given up on, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Rosalind Pruitt had grown up the second of 4 daughters on a modest tobacco farm outside Briar Hollow, a small farming settlement tucked into the rolling hill country of western Kentucky, in the years when the war was still a fresh wound in the memory of every family for 2 counties around, and the land itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what kind of peace it would be allowed to keep. Her father, Eli Marchbanks, was a curing man, one of the few in the region who understood the particular alchemy of smoke and salt and patience required to turn a seasoned hogs into meat that would carry a family safely through the lean months of winter, and he ran the largest smokehouse in the district, a sturdy log structure behind the family barn, where he hung not only his own family's meat but, for a modest fee, the hams and bacon of a dozen neighboring farms too small or too poor to build proper curing houses of their own. Rosalind spent more of her childhood in that smokehouse than in any parlor or schoolroom, tending the low hickory fires with her father from the time she was old enough to carry kindling without dropping it, and she absorbed, without ever being formally taught, the whole quiet science of it. How a fire too hot would cook the meat rather than cure it, how the smoke needed to be thin and cool and patient, how a ham hung too close to a beam would scorch while one hung too far from a heat would spoil before it ever properly cured, and how the entire process rewarded nothing so much as careful attention sustained over many slow weeks. Eli was not a man given to lengthy speeches, but he had a habit of repeating certain phrases to his daughters as they worked beside him, and the one Rosalind carried longest was his insistence that anything worth having in this life required someone patient enough to tend it properly, that meat cured in haste was meat wasted, and that the same was true, he believed, of land, of marriages, of friendships, and of a person's own good name. Her mother, Constance, died when Rosalind was 14, leaving Eli to raise 4 daughters largely alone, and it was in those years that Rosalind, the most practical and least sentimental of the sisters, took on much of the smokehouse work herself, learning to read the weather and the wood and the meat with an instinct that eventually surpassed even her father's, though she was too modest, then, to say so aloud. She met Thomas Pruitt at 19, a hard-working but restless young man from a neighboring county who came through Briar Hollow following seasonal farm labor, and who courted her with an earnestness that won over even her skeptical father, promising, as young men in love so often do, that he intended to settle down and build something lasting once they were married. They wed when Rosalind was 21, and Thomas used a small inheritance from his own late mother to purchase a modest farm at the edge of Briar Hollow, adjacent, as it happened, to the old Vance property, whose original owners had died without heirs some years before and whose land, including a small smokehouse of its own, had sat largely unclaimed and slowly deteriorating ever since. It is worth understanding, before the rest of this story unfolds, that Rosalind's deep, patient knowledge of curing and smoke, absorbed at her father's side through years of unhurried attention, would prove to be far more valuable than either she or Thomas ever imagined in those early hopeful years of their marriage, though the value it eventually revealed had nothing to do with meat at all. The fall, when it came, arrived not through any single catastrophe but through the slow accumulation of Thomas Pruitt's restlessness, a quality that had seemed like ambition when he was courting her but that revealed itself, over 13 years of marriage, to be something closer to an inability to stay satisfied with what he had. Thomas farmed adequately but without any particular skill or passion, and he grew, Over the years, increasingly drawn to speculative ventures that promise faster returns than the slow, patient work of tending crops and livestock, a timber schemed 2 counties over that consumed a full season's savings before collapsing when the buyer defaulted. A partnership in a small grain mill that soured after 18 months when his partner absconded with the operating funds. And finally, in the last years of his life, an increasingly desperate series of loans taken against the farm itself to fund a plan to invest in proposed rail spur that, in the end, was never built at all, the railroad company having abandoned the project after the initial surveys proved the terrain too costly to grade. Thomas died of a fever in the winter of Rosalind's 33rd year, leaving her not the modest, hard-won stability she had expected from 13 years of careful living, but a mountain of debt secured against the very land beneath her feet. Debt that the bank and the county seat, upon Thomas's death, moved with brisk efficiency to collect. Rosalind fought to keep the farm for nearly a year, selling off livestock, taking in mending and preserving work from neighboring families, and pleading with the bank's officers for patience she suspected they had little intention of granting. But in the end, the mathematics of the debt simply could not be overcome by a widow working alone, and the farm was foreclosed and sold at auction in the spring. The proceeds settling Thomas's obligations with almost nothing left over. What remained for Rosalind, after the bank and the creditors had taken their share, was $11, a small trunk of clothing and personal effects, and the bitter, humiliating knowledge that many of her neighbors, watching the auction unfold, seemed to regard her misfortune with a kind of detached pity that stopped well short of any actual offer of help, a few even murmuring, within her hearing, that Thomas Pruitt had always been a man who reached beyond his means, and that his widow was, perhaps paying the price for having stood by him through it. Rosalind endured this quiet judgment with the same steady composure her father had modeled through years of slow, careful work, refusing to give her neighbors the satisfaction of seeing her break, though the nights alone in the boarding house room she rented with her dwindling funds tested that composure more than she ever let anyone see. It was in this state, $11 and a trunk of belongings standing between her and true destitution, that Rosalind learned the county was finally auctioning off the old Vance property, including a collapsed Smokehouse, the land having sat in a kind of legal limbo for years while distant relatives disputed a claim that ultimately came to nothing, and something in her, hearing the word Smokehouse spoken aloud by the county clerk, stirred with a recognition she could not entirely explain, even to herself. The auction for the Vance property was held on a bright, unseasonably warm morning in early spring, drawing a modest crowd of Briar Hollow residents more interested in the gossip of watching Thomas Pruitt's widow attend a public sale than in any serious intention of bidding on land most considered more trouble than it was worth, given the state of disrepair the buildings had fallen into over years of neglect. The house itself had been claimed earlier in separate proceedings by a distant Vance cousin who intended to sell the lumber for salvage, but the Smokehouse, a small standalone structure set some distance from the main dwelling, had been overlooked in that earlier transaction, and now sat as its own separate lot, a leaning, blackened ruin with half its roof collapsed inward and its log walls bowing outward under the weight of years of neglect, generally regarded by everyone present as worthless, beyond whatever scrap value its old hand-hewn timbers might fetch. When the auctioneer called the lot, there was a pause of genuine amusement rather than interest, several of the assembled farmers exchanging looks that suggested no one intended to waste good money on a pile of rotting logs, and it was into this pause that Rosalind stepped forward and offered her full $11, an offer that drew immediate laughter from several corners of the crowd, not unkind exactly, but the particular laughter reserved for someone perceived to be acting against their own evident interest. The auctioneer, mildly startled but unwilling to turn down the only bid he was likely to receive, accepted her offer within moments, and Rosalind found herself, transaction complete, the owner of a collapsed Smokehouse and precisely nothing else in the world beyond clothes on her back and the trunk she had left at the boarding house. The laughter followed her as she walked a short distance from the auction site to examine her purchase more closely, several onlookers trailing along less out of genuine interest and a kind of morbid curiosity to see what a woman with nothing would possibly do with a ruin like that. And Rosalind, standing before the leaning structure in the spring sunlight, found herself remembering, with unexpected clarity, her father's Smokehouse from her girlhood, the particular quality of patient, attention he had brought to every beam and joint of that building, and she understood, looking at the collapsed roof and the bowing walls before her, that what she was truly looking at was not ruin but neglect, a structure that had simply been abandoned by people who lacked the patience or knowledge to see what remained sound beneath the damage. She spent that first afternoon simply walking the perimeter of the building, assessing which timbers had rotted beyond saving and which, protected by the overhanging remains of the roof, might still be structurally sound. And it was in this careful initial assessment, running her hands along a heavy corner beam that had somehow escaped the worst of the water damage, that she noticed something that struck her as immediately curious. A section of the rafters near the building's rear, still, largely intact beneath a portion of roof that had held despite the collapse elsewhere, appeared to have been reinforced at some point with additional bracing that had nothing to do with normal Smokehouse construction, as though something considerably heavier than hanging meat had once needed support up in that dark, smoke-blackened space. Rosalind spent the following 2 weeks laboring alone at the ruined Smokehouse from dawn until the light failed each evening, sleeping in a small lean-to she constructed from salvage board against the building's more stable rear wall, subsisting on what little she could forage in the occasional charity of Briar Hollow's kinder residents, chief among them an elderly widow named Agatha Winthrop, who lived alone on a neighboring farm and who, unlike most of the town, had never joined in the laughter at the auction, instead bringing Rosalind a basket of provisions within her first week of camping at the ruin, and returning periodically thereafter with small gifts of food that she insisted, with gruff kindness, were merely surplus from her own kitchen and nothing Rosalind should feel beholden over. It was Agatha who first mentioned, in an offhand comment over one such delivery, that the old Van Smokehouse had a peculiar reputation in Briar Hollow dating back nearly 2 decades, that old Jeremiah Vance, the last of the family to properly work the property before his death, had been known as an unusually private man in his final years, rarely allowing visitors near the smokehouse despite it standing well apart from the main house, and that some in town had always found the secrecy strange for a structure that, by all appearances, served no purpose beyond ordinary meat curing. This offhand remark lodged itself in Rosalind's mind alongside her own observation of the unusual reinforced rafters, and she began, over the following days of clearing debris and stabilizing the surviving structure, to pay particular attention to that reinforced section of the building's rear, eventually working up the courage and the necessary ladder, salvaged and repaired from fallen barn wood, to climb up into the rafters themselves for a closer inspection. What she found, wedged into a shallow cavity that had been deliberately built into the reinforced framework rather than occurring naturally, using bracing clearly added well after the smokehouse's original construction, was a long, narrow wooden box, weathered but intact, sealed with a simple iron latch gone stiff with rust but not entirely seized. Working the latch free took the better part of an hour, balanced awkwardly on the ladder in the dim, smoke-scented dark of the rafters, and when the box finally opened, what lay inside was not, as she had half expected given the local rumors, any manner of hidden treasure or family valuables, but a collection of carefully wrapped papers, a small leather-bound account book, and, curiously, a set of surveyor's tools, a compass, and a folding measuring chain of a quality far beyond what an ordinary farmer would have owned or needed. It took Rosalind the better part of an evening, working by lantern light in a makeshift lean-to, to make full sense of what she had found, and what emerged from that careful reading rewrote everything Briar Hollow believed it understood about the years immediately following the war. The account book and papers belonged not to Jeremiah Vance himself, but to a man named Ezekiel Toombs, a federal land surveyor who had been sent through the region in the years just after the war's end to help resolve a tangle of disputed property boundaries left in the conflict's chaotic aftermath. Boundaries that had grown confused when county records were destroyed or lost during the fighting, and when displaced families returned home to find their old markers gone, and their neighbors' claims suddenly overlapping their own. Ezekiel Toombs's careful notes, written in a precise surveyor's hand, described how he had uncovered, in the course of his official work, a systematic pattern of land theft carried out by a prominent Briar Hollow family, the Ashworths, who held considerable influence over the county land office in those uncertain post-war years and who had used that influence to quietly redraw boundary lines in their own favor, absorbing acreage from at least 7 smaller farms belonging to families too poor, too displaced, or in several documented cases too recently freed from bondage to effectively contest paperwork filed by a family as established and respected as the Ashworths. Toombs's notes named specific families and specific parcels, cross-reference against the original pre-war surveys he had managed to locate in county archive before they, too, mysteriously went missing from the record, and his account book contained detailed calculations showing exactly how many acres had been improperly transferred and to whom, evidence, in short, of a fraud that had quietly enriched one family at the direct expense of their neighbor's rightful land during a period when those Neighbors had the least power in the county's history to object. Toombs's papers explained, in a final entry dated shortly before the trail of documentation simply stopped, that he had begun to suspect the extent of what he was uncovering placed him in some danger, noting that his inquiries had drawn pointed and unfriendly attention from Elias Ashworth, the family patriarch at the time, and that he intended to complete his survey quietly and deliver his findings directly to federal authorities in the state capital rather than risk having his work suppressed or destroyed locally. There the account book ended, with no further entries and no record Rosalind could find anywhere in the papers of what became of Ezekiel Toombs after that final worried note, though Agatha Winthrop, when Rosalind cautiously raised the surveyor's name with her the following day, recalled, after some thought, a vague old story about a government man who had come through the county some 18 years back and simply never was seen to leave, a story that had never been much investigated at the time given the general chaos and dislocation of those post-war years, when strangers passing through and never returning was, sadly, not so uncommon an occurrence as to draw much official attention. Rosalind understood, sitting with the weight of Ezekiel Toombs's careful documentation spread before her in the lantern light, that Jeremiah Vance, whatever his own role or lack of role in the surveyor's disappearance, had apparently hidden this evidence rather than destroy it, choosing, for reasons his own death had left permanently unexplained, to preserve rather than eliminate proof of a fraud that had touched families throughout Briar Hollow, and she found herself wondering whether Vance's well-known reclusiveness in his final years reflected a private guilt over what he knew, or simply a fear of what the Ashworth family, still prominent in the county to this day, might do to anyone who threatened to expose them. It did not take long for word to spread through Briar Hollow that Rosalind Pruitt had found something significant hidden in the old Smokehouse rafters, the details growing more exaggerated with each retelling as such stories do in small settlements starved for genuine news, and it did not take much longer for that word to reach Harlan Ashworth, grandson of Elias Ashworth and now the family's leading figure, a man whose considerable local standing rested substantially, though few in town fully appreciated the extent of it, on land his grandfather had acquired during those chaotic post-war years. Harlan called on Rosalind at the Smokehouse site directly, dressed in the fine tailored clothing that marked him as one of the county's most prosperous citizens, and his manner, at first, carried the same avuncular concern so many powerful men affect toward those with less standing than themselves, expressing sympathy for her hardship and offering, with apparent generosity, to purchase whatever old papers she might have found for a sum considerably beyond what such papers could ordinarily be worth, framing the offer as simple charity toward a struggling widow rather than any acknowledgement of the paper's true significance. Rosalind, who had learned patience from a father who never rushed to curing fire and composure from 13 years of managing a difficult marriage with quiet dignity, thanked Harlan for his concern, and told him she required time to consider the matter, revealing nothing of what she had already come to understand. In the days that followed, the pressure grew considerably less courteous. The small amount of credit she had managed to establish at the general store for building supplies was abruptly withdrawn without explanation. A local carpenter who had agreed to help her properly rebuild the Smokehouse roof suddenly discovered he was too busy to take on new work, and Agatha Winthrop confided, in a hushed conversation heavy with worry, that her own son, who rented farmland from an Ashworth cousin, had received a pointed inquiry about whether his mother's continued friendliness toward the Pruitt widow might affect the terms of his lease going forward. Rosalind recognized in this pattern the same kind of quiet, institutional leverage that had allowed the Ashworth family to steal land from powerless neighbors nearly 2 decades before, and she understood that pursuing justice through any official channel the Ashworth might influence, which in a county this size meant nearly every official channel available, would likely end in the evidence simply vanishing a second time, just as the original pre-war surveys had vanished from the county archives once before. Rather than risk that outcome, Rosalind made the same choice that had occurred to her more than once while sitting alone with Ezekiel Toombs's careful notes. She would take the evidence directly to the very families it named as wronged, trusting that community's collective memory and collective voice would prove harder to suppress than any single widow's claim, however well documented. She spent the following weeks traveling to each of the 7 families identified in Toombs's account book, several of whom still farmed land adjacent to what had once been their rightful boundaries, now held by Ashworth relatives or associates, and what she found in each conversation was less shock than a kind of long-buried, half-suppressed suspicion finally given evidence and voice. Families who had always sensed something irregular about how their acreage had shrunk in those post-war years. but who had lacked the standing, the documentation, or simply the safety to ever properly question it. Among these was an elderly, formerly enslaved farmer named Josephus Reddick, who had been among the first in the county to secure his own small plot in the years immediately following emancipation, only to watch a portion of that hard-won acreage quietly absorbed into an adjoining Ashworth holding through paperwork he had never been permitted to fully examine or contest, and who wept upon seeing Toombs's original survey confirming what he had believed but never been able to prove for nearly 2 decades. The particular grief of a man given long overdue validation for an injustice the whole county had simply allowed to stand. Rosalind gathered 5 of the 7 affected families over the following month, 2 having since died with no surviving heirs to speak for them, and on a Sunday gathering at the Briar Hollow Meeting House, the one public building in town large enough to hold a crowd that word of the matter had drawn from across the county, she stood before her assembled neighbors, the very people who had laughed at her auction purchase not so many weeks before, and told them, plainly and with the same patient thoroughness her father had brought to every careful task, the story of Ezekiel Toombs, of the Smokehouse Rafters that had hidden his final work for 18 years, and of the systematic fraud his documentation preserved against everyone's easy forgetting. She read from his careful notes. She presented the original surveys alongside the altered county record she had since managed to locate through a sympathetic clerk willing to quietly compare the documents once the broader pattern was made known to him. And then she called forward Josephus Reddick and the other affected families, who stood before their neighbors and confirmed, each in turn, the long-suspected truth of what had been done to their land. Harlan Ashworth, present in the gathering as he was present at nearly every significant public occasion in Briar Hollow, attempted at first to dismiss the entire matter as the confused ramblings of a desperate widow and a collection of old, unreliable papers, but his composure faltered visibly as family after family stepped forward with their own corroborating memories and grievances. And by the time the county's newly appointed circuit judge, a man with no particular ties to the Ashworth family and no patience for a scandal of this documented magnitude, opened a formal inquiry the following week, the weight of collective testimony alongside Toombs's meticulous original survey proved more than sufficient to unravel 18 years of quiet theft. The restoration that followed did not happen instantly, land disputes of that complexity rarely resolving with any speed even under the most sympathetic judicial attention, but it unfolded steadily and, crucially, publicly, in a way that made quiet suppression impossible a second time. Over the following year, the circuit court worked methodically through each disputed boundary, restoring rightful acreage to Josephus Reddick and 3 of the 4 other surviving affected families, modest parcels of land that nonetheless represented, for families who had farmed reduced holdings for nearly 2 decades, a genuine and meaningful improvement in their circumstances, land enough to expand their own crops, to pass down to children who had grown up believing their families modest. Situation was simply how things had always been rather than the direct result of theft. Harlan Ashworth, though he faced no criminal charges given the passage of time and the death of the original wrongdoer, his own grandfather, found his standing in Briar Hollow permanently and visibly diminished, the respectful deference the town had long extended to the Ashworth name curdling into a wary distance that no amount of his family's remaining wealth could fully repair. A quiet social reckoning that Rosalind never sought directly, but that the town arrived at on its own once the truth stood plainly before them. As for Rosalind herself, the smokehouse she had purchased for $11 amid general laughter proved, once the truth of its hidden rafters became known throughout the county, to sit on land whose disputed history the circuit court's inquiry also clarified, confirming that the parcel had never actually been legitimately included in the Ashworth family's broader post-war acquisitions, but had remained rightfully part of the original Vance holding all along, meaning Rosalind's modest $11 purchase carried clear, uncontested title to considerably more surrounding acreage than anyone, including Rosalind herself, had initially understood. She rebuilt the smokehouse over the following months with her own patient hands and the eventual willing help of neighbors who had once laughed at her, now approaching with a mixture of gratitude and quiet shame. And she resumed, in time, something very close to the trade her own father had taught her, curing meat for families throughout Briar Hollow with the same unhurried, careful attention Eli Marchbanks had modeled for her decades before. It is worth remembering, in the end, that Rosalind Pruitt began this story as a woman the whole town had decided to laugh at, a widow with $11 and nothing left to lose, buying a ruin that everyone else had already condemned as worthless. She did not climb into those blackened rafters expecting to find anything beyond confirmation of what the building might still be salvaged for. She climbed up because her father had taught her that structures, like people, were too often abandoned by those who lacked the patience to look closely enough to see what remained sound beneath the visible damage. And what she found up there in the smoke-darkened dark was not treasure in any ordinary sense, but something Briar Hollow needed far more urgently, a long-buried truth that finally returned to 5 families what patient, quiet theft had taken from them nearly 2 decades before. Thank you for spending this time with Rosalind's story, and with all of us who gather here to remember the value others are too quick to laugh away. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who has ever been mocked for holding on to something the world had already given up on. We would love to hear from you in the comments below. What is a time you found real value in something others had already written off as ruined beyond saving? We read every story you share with us, and we are always moved by how many of you carry your own quiet Rosalinds within your history. Until next time, stay close.